Thank you for inviting me, for being here with you today, and it's good to see so many people actually here this morning. The weather is a little bit better than yesterday, but this is good. So what I'm going to talk about is somewhat what we call, or what is the natural capital, which we consider to be the foundation for blue and green growth. So, and the structure of my talk is as follows. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about these definitions of natural resources and natural capital, because it can be, there's some sort of terminology confusion sometimes that you see. Then I'll link that to a discussion on the blue and the green economy, touch upon blue and green growth. I wasn't here all day yesterday, so I don't know if you guys talked about sort of a little bit the history of these concepts, but I'm going to mention them just very briefly. Then I will link the definitions of natural capital to the blue and green growth concepts, talk and mention some challenges and actions that we need to engage in to really secure this foundation for blue and green growth, and then focus and zoom in particular into one particular area that I'm interested in, and that is mapping and measuring ecosystem services. And then finally, a few words on how we possibly can secure the future. So let's get to it. So I want to start out by sort of looking at these different concepts, natural capital and natural resources. And you may ask yourselves, maybe are these concepts exactly the same? Is there actually a difference between these concepts, natural resources and natural capital? And the short answer to that question is kinda. If that's an answer, it's not really an answer. But I want to explain a little bit what the difference actually is. If we look at an economy where, or a society where people actually live, that is surrounded by something that we call natural capital. From natural capital, we derive a lot of different ecosystem services who serve as an input to the national economy or to society. They can be of many different types. They can be provisioning services, and these are sort of inputs of raw materials, energy, food, water, and things like that. We can have supporting and regulating services, and then we're essentially looking at what we usually talk about as being the life support services. These are, more, for example, water filtration, circulation of nutrients, and then we have cultural services, who are, for example, recreational services or religious services or educational services, all that we derive from natural capital. And then on the other side over here, it's not just that the national economy or society extracts things from the environment or from natural capital. We also pump a lot of waste into the environment. And then natural capital, through its services, helps us dilute that. And that's also considered a regulating service. And that, an example of that is, for example, carbon sequestration. But what about the difference between these concepts? Normally, when we talk about natural resources, and for example, in natural resource economics, then we're primarily focusing on simply what we call provisioning services. And they then are classified even further. We talk about them as being renewable or non-renewable resources, and the bioeconomy primarily, that we were discussing yesterday, primarily focuses just on the renewable provisioning services part of natural capital. So you see that there is a difference between these concepts, natural resources, as we've talked about it sort of in, I often want to call it sort of the old-fashioned way, and natural capital. Natural resources are, of course, natural capital, but natural capital is a much wider concept. So when we are then formally defining natural capital, it's defined as the elements of nature that directly and indirectly produce through its processes and functions value or benefits to people. These can be biotic and abiotic and includes all kinds of different things, fish stocks, trees or forests, soils, land, and so on and so forth. Ecosystem services are then essentially the anthropocentric benefits that we derive from natural capital. And those can be what we call provisioning. These are the direct services. This is what we normally talk about as being natural resources. And then indirect, which are then the regulating, supporting, and cultural services. When we're talking about and looking at the green growth concepts, which are obviously directly linked to the green economy, then the growth areas are very much sort of in new and unconventional use of the provisioning services that are out there, but then also growth in what we call indirect ecosystem services, such as cultural services. An example of that is tourism. So natural capital provides the benefits, but the ecosystem services are the benefits. So you see there's a clear connection, obviously, between these concepts. Keep in mind, and we'll get to this in a moment, natural capital provides us, the same stock of natural capital provides us with a lot of different services, not necessarily though at the same time. And this is important for management because we cannot get everything. There are trade-offs and choices that we need to make. What we also know is that if we're overusing natural capital, it loses its ability to provide us with these essential services. And then we have various classification systems for ecosystem services. There's one called CICES that everybody seems to be using these days, and then we have TEEP. In the past, we talked about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Classification System, but that is changing. We don't use that so much anymore. Most are using CICES, and that's, for example, what the European Union is actually using. The difference between these categories is that TEEP adds a habitat category. But I just want to flush this just to make you aware that there are different classification systems now that we are relying on, not the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Classification System. So just one example, I like to bring up soils as much as I can because I feel like that's the forgotten resource. If you open a resource economics textbook, you're not going to find a chapter on soils. So soils are natural capital. We talk about soil natural capital, and they provide us with a lot of different essential ecosystem services. They give us sort of a space for plant growth. They give us essentially basis for as an engineering medium. They provide us with habitat for soil organisms, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of the conceptual foundation of this. But what about green and blue growth, or the blue and green economy? I wanted to just give you a very short historical perspective. And I don't know if you talked about this yesterday at all, sort of the history of this. But the sort of green economy discussion is not new at all. And it was first formally used, at least according to the UN, used in 1989 in a report written for the UK government. A report that was actually about sustainable development and the validity of that concept. Then essentially, sustainable development, that concept took over. And that's a concept we were primarily focusing on for many years. But then suddenly in 2008, the green economy or green growth re-emerged with a force. And what happened was that at that time, we started proposing, and the UN proposed actually, as well as various other organizations, green economy and green growth as a solution to the multifaceted problems that the world was facing and is still facing. We have climate change, we had a financial meltdown, so the green economy was seen as a way out of that. And if you read, for example, what a lot of countries were doing all over the world, even the US government was doing this, they had a green stimulus package. And so the green growth and the green economy concept was very much, so it re-emerged when we had the economic collapse, basically the worldwide economic collapse almost, in 2008. Following this push, then the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Programme, launched what they call the Green Economy Initiative in 2008, and then that slowly gained momentum. And then actually leading up to the Rio conference on sustainable development in 2012, the green economy concept became a key theme. And this you all know, I assume most of you were sort of involved in preparations for Rio +20. But here we have the green economy definition. And this is a definition that UNEP put forward in 2011, and I'm going to just read it out to you. The green economy is an economy that results in improved human well-being and social equity, while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. It is low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. And so you see that this is a fairly broad concept. It's not a replacement for sustainable development, though. It is a tool that we use to go and try to reach and move towards sustainable development. Green growth is then seen essentially as economic growth derived from within the green economy. The OECD has pushed quite heavily or heavily for the green growth concepts and the green economy concepts, and here is a definition on green growth from OECD. It is economic growth and development that is achieved while ensuring that natural assets, and I put that in sort of, that's not theirs, it's mine, I'm going to explain that in a moment, assets continue to provide the ecosystem services on which our well-being resides. And so the key here is that we have to maintain our natural assets such that they continue providing us with essential services. And this means that we have to catalyze investment and innovation linked to these services. In this case, natural assets is the same as natural capital. It's exactly the same thing. And it's the same concept that we use actually within the system of environmental and economic accounts within the UN. And actually the Ministry for the Environment here and Natural Resources here in Iceland is now working towards actually natural capital accounts, which is really interesting. But what about the blue economy? The blue economy, that concept sort of was developed at a very similar time, and that concept came forward when small island developing states made the case that we really needed to emphasize the importance of the ocean. And obviously the ocean is tremendously important for these countries, it's tremendously important for us here in Iceland. So the blue economy is then defined very similarly as the green economy, except now we're deriving growth, basically, from aquatic sectors or even marine sectors. FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, has invested heavily in this concept, and they actually have what is something that is called the Blue Economy Initiative. So blue growth, according to FAO, is defined as economic growth and social development emanating from living resources of the coastal zones and inland waters and from related activities in the coastal zones, which minimize environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable use of living aquatic resources. So here they actually focus and emphasize living aquatic resources. Often people get a little bit confused about what exactly blue growth and blue economy includes, or green growth and green economy includes. Essentially what it involves is that it's any activity really that produces growth that actually does not degrade our natural capital. That's essentially what it is. So it's not everything that we do in the ocean, for example, that can be considered part of the blue economy. So just to emphasize that, just to put this in context, so what is it that we need to do? We have to make sure that green or blue growth, it's essentially an increase in GDP that does not result from nor lead to a degradation of natural capital. How do we do that? Well, we make sure that our actions do not overwhelm the regenerative capacity of natural capital, and that we do not overwhelm the waste assimilative services of natural capital. How do we do that? We invest in natural capital, make sure that natural capital stocks grow. We reduce or increase the efficiency by which we use our natural resources and natural capital, and we try to reduce the size of waste flows, or if we can't, as the things that we cannot reduce, we actually refeed them back into the production line, and this is sort of what the circular economy really is all about. But we have challenges. There are significant challenges when it comes to essentially developing these concepts further. There is a significant lack of knowledge actually about the contribution of different natural capital types or ecosystem services to the green or the blue economy. And here I'm primarily thinking about what we call sort of the non-traditional ecosystem services, the ones that are sort of not provisional, but all the other ones, the indirect ones, the life support ones, but they are tremendously important to these concepts. This means that we do not have a holistic picture of what the green or the blue economy really is all about. And this results in that we're not realizing trade-offs between different services. And this is a management issue. And then secondly, another challenge that we have is that now the foundation of blue and green growth, for example, for blue growth fisheries all over the world, as we heard yesterday, are overused or being degraded. And we have to get the basics right. So we cannot just jump over to this new concept. We need to make sure that the foundation is there. And basically because now we're dealing with trade-offs between a lot of different services derived from the same capital stock, these traditional sector-based management systems are not sufficient. And there are several institutional barriers against that. And then finally, the metrics that we have do not capture the whole picture. We cannot use GDP to indicate whether we're getting green growth or not. We need new metrics. But of course, there are a lot of things that we can do, and that's something we should engage in. We can and should set clear, measurable, and internally consistent goals and targets for a sustainable green economy. Here we're trying to answer the question, what do we exactly want? What are the services that we are going to emphasize? Because there are trade-offs. We cannot have everything. So we need to think this through and make decisions, enlightened decisions. And then we need to be able to assess and communicate the performance towards these targets. And that means we need new metrics. We often call it going beyond GDP. And that's what we need to do if we're real about pushing for green or blue growth. We need these. And then we need to classify, map, and assess natural capital and ecosystem services. And then we need to spatially manage them because there's competition in space. And then finally, we need to make sure that we are able to develop and apply sustainability standards, guidelines, and best practices that support the blue and the green economy. And this is one of the projects that belong to the NordBio project, where we have actually been looking at and comparing across all the Nordic nations, sort of the conventional natural capital stocks, the provisioning natural capital stocks, and looking at what the sustainability criteria are across all Nordic countries, and then putting forward some recommendations what we can do. So I wanted to focus just at the end of my talk on this particular point, classifying, mapping, and assessing natural capital and ecosystem services. And we can do this, and there's a methodology out there that has been developed that enables us to move forward. So how do we do this? We begin by a particular or some spatial classification system that we have, some way of identifying and defining land use or different types of land cover. And we then link that to something that we call a matrix model, which can be based on the CICES classification system. We take the different land use types, we overlay that with the different ecosystem services that we derive from different land use types, and then we fill out the matrix. And we fill out the matrix through using a lot of different methods. We can use expert interviews. We can ask them about the relative importance of different habitat types for particular ecosystem service, for example, carbon sequestration. We then also can use statistics that are out there in the literature, carbon sequestration rates, for example, for different habitat types. And then we have models. We then translate that over to maps, where we map the value, and then that gives us a spatial representation of different ecosystem services. And there is an international mapping effort ongoing. The European Union has such mapping effort. It's called Mapping and Assessment of Ecosystem Services, MAES effort. And this was generated by the European Union to help member states reach one of the things that they want to do within their biodiversity strategy, that is that we have no net loss of ecosystem services. And there is a working group working on this, and it's called MAES. And it's kind of funny, the guy that directs this activity is actually called Joachim Maes. He has the same last name as this. And then we have a supporting and coordinating action that is called Esmeralda, that participates and collaborates closely with Maes. So it's a tiered mapping method. And we start out by maybe asking experts of the relative importance of different ecosystem services. We then use available data, statistics that are already out there. Then we look at models and try to simulate these. And then we go towards the economic assessment. That's the last step in this. There are a lot of reports out there that have been published on this. And if you're interested, I'll put it there if this is something you might be interested in. But what this does for us is that now the European Union is trying to come up with a framework for integrated assessment of ecosystems and natural capital. And this then can help us, as I call it, secure the foundation for green and blue growth, because that's what natural capital really is. We need to maintain it. So we start out by mapping the ecosystems. We assess the condition of this ecosystem. We assess the ecosystem services derived from these ecosystems, and then we link that to the basically, we just showed you, and then we link that to how much action, how much use actually, what kind of impact that has on the provisioning of different ecosystem services from different ecosystems. So here we have brought in the management perspective, which truly has the potential to become a truly integrated perspective, giving us a holistic picture of what we need to do to secure the foundation. So finally, there are significant challenges when it comes to development of the blue and the green economy. There is lack of knowledge. There are institutional challenges. We need new success metrics and criteria, but there are massively interesting and exciting possibilities for the green and blue economy. We just need to be sure that we secure the foundation. And I actually think that the Nordic countries should be able and should show excellence in this regard. Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes for Q&A. We'll start with a Twitter question, which seems very simple, but it might actually be more complicated when it comes to answering it. And it's, so who owns natural capital?
It depends on what natural capital you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Everything is natural capital. Everything that surrounds the economy is natural capital. There are certain types that are private property, but most of them actually are public goods. And that's what complicates the management situation significantly.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
another one?
There's another question, maybe not that simple either, or maybe a request. Could you expand a little bit on the relationship between the bioeconomy and the circular economy?
Oh, yeah. Well, the circular economy is very much about bringing back, for example, waste streams into the production economy. And these concepts are, this is a good question, these concepts are tightly interlinked, I would say, tightly interlinked. But you can have a circular economy, you can use, for example, things that are not necessarily renewable. You can use them again and again. So the circular economy, I would think, includes more than the bioeconomy. Because the bioeconomy primarily focuses on renewable resources. And that's, of course, where we're trying to head with the circular economy. But it's a little bit a wider concept in that sense. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Hólmfríður has the microphone over there, so you can raise your hands for questions. I wanted to ask you, because you talk about GDP, and we, in general, in the world, still use the old school definition of GDP, which doesn't take any of this into account. Isn't it just time that we need to take those metrics into account, which make up such a big part of nations' well-being, even though it doesn't count with the kind of old school measurements of GDP?
Yeah. I think this is absolutely fundamental, because how are we going to plan? Basically, how can we plan towards green or blue growth if we don't have a metric that accurately measures those things? And there are metrics out there that have been developed that we can absolutely and should develop. And here in Iceland, we could be a nice test case of doing this properly. But there are metrics out there, and there's not really a reason why we wouldn't develop these concepts. I'm not saying we need to get rid of GDP. That's an important concept when it comes to the size of the economy. But it does not measure green or blue growth. And you know, an increase, economic growth basically is just an increase in GDP, right?
Can it be merged in
I mean, absolutely. That's because it's growth, essentially. And there are metrics out there that actually correct conventional GDP metrics with regard to, for example, environmental degradation, or correct it for growth that is derived from degradation of natural capital. We can correct this.
But then we need to measure it, right?
Absolutely.
And know how much it is.
Yeah.
Right.
But in addition to this, or connected to this, are we moving forward? Because, you know, I guess we would have been able to have this discussion like 5 years ago. You would have said the same. There are metrics out there. We should just go out and use them. And now 5 years have passed. And are we moving forward, or why are we not moving forward?
We've been saying this since 1992.
Exactly.
So,
it's only 5 years. It's more like
it's
24 years.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It is, well, here's the thing. There is I think, this is just a personal opinion, there's a reason for why we haven't moved, I think, towards these other metrics. And the fact of the matter is that quite frequently we're using these metrics for international comparisons. There are statistical agencies in every single country of the world that actually, for example, measures GDP. These are standardized methods that are internationally comparable. The methods that I was referring to that we can use to measure green GDP or green or blue growth, they're not standardized. Mm-hmm. And you cannot have these yet international comparisons. There is some interesting activity though going on, for example, in the United States, where all US states have actually come together and they're trying to put forward a coherent and consistent methodology for one of these metrics, the genuine progress indicator. So there is movement forward. And there was a big report written in 2009 by the Sarkozy Committee, I don't know if you remember that one, are aware of that one, that sort of essentially recommended that we would have to come up with a standardized methodology because the GDP metrics are not adequate. But we keep saying this, but I think it's very much sort of a standardization issue. We're just not there yet, unfortunately.
Right. Maybe a question of political will or focus or
well, yes, because essentially what happens also is that it's very difficult to be the politician that's in power when suddenly, green growth starts going down. So when you start showing metrics like that are negative, in their opinion, that's difficult.
Yeah, it's less of an incentive to boast about. Another question. Yesterday we saw definitions on the bioeconomy. Friðrik Friðriksson writes, what would be the route for Iceland to implement the blue policy announcement?
The blue policy announcement, I wasn't here yesterday. So there was a blue policy announcement?
Right. Friðrik, where are you? Would you like to elaborate on that question?
Please.
Right, by Davíð Høybråten? No.
Oh.
Gunnar Bragi.
The bioeconomy strategy of Iceland. I wasn't aware of the bioeconomy strategy of Iceland, I'm sorry. But what I think the main issue here, if we're trying to implement this properly, is that I would repeat the same recommendations that I did during my lecture. We need to get the basics right. We need to make sure that we're actually maintaining our natural capital stocks, and we need new metrics. And then there is fundamentally important to break down sort of the institutional barriers when it comes to the integrated management of the different services that we derive from the natural capital stocks. So it's not just about the conventional natural resources. It's also about all of these unconventional ones. And that's where we need to go.
And then there's, okay.
Thank you. My name is Geir Oddsson, Senior Advisor at the Nordic Council of Ministers. First of all, it worries me a little bit that you were not aware of the Icelandic Bioeconomy strategy work.
Well, I'm aware of the bioeconomy strategy work, but I wasn't here yesterday in the morning to hear what he said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's on his table.
Yeah.
With the hope that it will be moving forward. That was not my intervention. It was about measuring the performance in relationship to natural capital or ecosystem services or green growth. And when you look at these measurements, indicators that are out there right now, you see, for example, that Iceland is not doing very well in quite a number of them. And it always surprises me when I read these World Economic Forum compilations that Iceland is doing really, really badly on the oceans. Can you tell us a little bit about, or can you speculate about why that is and what needs to be done then to do better?
I'm not an expert on the oceans, I have to say, I have to admit. But I think if we are looking towards, for example, sustainability metrics when it comes to the oceans, and there's a particular sustainability metric that has been applied by a particular international organization. I can't remember the name of it. These metrics, I would argue, are actually not properly accounting for the sustainability of fish stocks. That's essentially, that we actually looked at that quite closely. The group of us were actually designing sustainability metrics that can be applied to every nation all over the world. And we looked very closely at exactly the metrics that they apply to the sustainability of marine fish stocks. And they are significantly flawed. Another issue is that there are particular international agreements that we actually need to implement that we haven't. And that's another reason that Iceland is not coming out very well when it comes to these metrics. But it is interesting when we compare and look at the Icelandic condition or the status that Iceland has according to these different metrics. There is a wide range of status. Sometimes we're doing really well, for example, on the scale of the Environmental Performance Index that is maintained by Yale, but then we're doing the worst in the world when it comes to environmental footprinting or ecological footprinting. Iceland has the largest ecological footprint in the world. We have actually updated this assessment. We still have the largest ecological footprint in the world. So it depends on the metric that you're referring to. Sometimes we're doing really well, sometimes we're doing particularly badly. And there are different reasons because these metrics are all different. But we were quite concerned about the sustainability metric for fish stocks. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it was quite concerning. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Þröstur Eysteinsson. We have this old-fashioned view that the world economy is controlled somehow by nation states, by governments, by politicians. It's not. We have a slightly newer view that it's controlled by multinational corporations. It's not really. The current view is that the world economy is mostly controlled by investors. Now, given that investors control most of the decision-making about the world economy today, how can you get this message about a green economy to investors?
This is a fantastic question, and there's no answer to it. No. Thank you for that. There are several ways that we can actually do that, and what is really interesting is that if you actually, you appeal to the bottom line of the companies. That's generally how we do it. And what we can see now, for example, is that if you look at the stock market, you can actually show there's a particular sustainable sort of group of companies, and we have sort of a green market, like the status of the market. And these companies apparently are doing better than the other ones. So they are excelling in their economic performance much better than the conventional sort of companies, the more dirty companies. So you can show that there seems to be a benefit to the bottom line of actually engaging in what we call green activities. And this has been confirmed all over the world because there's enormous value-generating opportunities linked to the green economy. Not only linked to image, but there are significant cost savings, and there are significant opportunities in, for example, investing in something that is what we call unconventional. So you appeal to the bottom line of the multinationals, and it seems somewhat to be working. At least when we looked at, I don't know if many of you were in Paris in 2015, December 2015, it was extremely interesting to witness the push by multinational companies to the international community to actually do something about this problem. And that was new. I had not witnessed that so clearly as we did in Paris. I don't know if you guys agree with me that were there, but I felt a difference. And suddenly the banks were there, and the insurance companies were there, and they were all saying, we need to do something about this. Why? Because if we don't, it's going to have a negative impact on our bottom line. So, and we can make this case.
Thank you, Brynhildur.
Sure.
I think we're done.
Yeah.
No more
Yeah.
hands.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So we can even stick to the time schedule.
Yeah, more or less.
wonderful.
So-
I have to let you guys know, I have to leave. I'm not walking out of the talks. Thank you.